Hello there, we're going to do another MagJS tutorial. Actually, this is a part 3 for our getting started with MagJS, my first MagJS example. Instead of creating the code pen as we normally do from the boilerplates, this time we're just going to take our previous part 2 example code pen and fork it. Now this URL was in the description of part 2, and this fork one will be in the description of the YouTube video part 3. So why don't I first fork the project? Do a little setup here. So previously, all we were doing was dynamically changing it. It wasn't based on any event. It was just an interval, changing it every 2 seconds. So what we're going to do now is we're going to get rid of the interval, and we're going to introduce a click handler event. So in our component, we're going to change some things. So first off, let's go to our component template. Right now, it's just greeting div. Let's put back our bold tag that we had to actually place the message in. And we're going to also add a p tag and a button that's going to say change message. Okay, so we have our p tag, our bold tag. So first thing I'm going to do is update our component, stateless component definition. So our message, and we're also going to add click handler like that. We're going to introduce back our selectors. So b tag for the message, and then our button tag will have an onClick, which will equal our click handler. Okay, so once we have everything in place, let's just make sure. We don't really need to dynamically do it like that, so we're just going to use our greeting here like this. So what are we missing? Well, first thing to note is that we're calling greeting still with just a message string instead of a property. So why don't we do that? Let's add our property, message. Okay, so you see we added message, message shows up, we have a button, but there's no click handler yet. So why don't we just quickly add a click handler. Click handler. It's going to create a little function over here. Now, I'm going to show you kind of an off-the-cuff way to do this to make this just work, and then I'm going to show you what you might call the proper way with a stateful component. So first, let's just make this work however we can in just plain JavaScript. So let's create our function, and we'll just do console output to show that we've been clicked. Make sure the click works, right? And there you go. You can see that we have our click handler that's being added to the button in our component. Let me just do a little tidy up here. So just to review again, our component is a simple stateless component, dumb component that has a template here, and then a component definition, which is some selectors, our message for the bold tag, and then within our button, we're saying an attribute of the click event, run this handler, which is being passed in. That handler is being run. Now, what we really want to happen is the random message to change when it's clicked. So why don't we just do this in the most simple way possible? We're going to say random message equal this new thing. Basically rerun the code above. Now, do you think this will work? Do you think when I click it, it will actually update this guy here? Well, in JavaScript, that's just not possible because this guy would need to run right up there as well. So if I put him like this, what do you think is going to happen? Why don't we check it out? Now it changes. See that? So this is what we call a dirty way of running this just to make it work. It's the same code happening in two different places. You can create a function that does it, call it a render function, for instance, but we're not going to get into a clean way to make something that's dirty. We're going to, in fact, show you the MagJS way to do this. And all that is we're going to create a stateful component. So what's the difference between a stateful component and a non-stateful component? As we said in part 1, the most important difference is the fact that when you do the component definition, instead of it being defined with a function, it's defined with an object. So why don't we do that right now? Why don't we keep everything what it is, but create a new container, okay? We can reuse a container, we'll create a new one. Well, why don't we, for now, just reuse the same container, and we're going to reuse our greeting output container into our stateful module, or we can create a message app module. So div ID equal message app. So what we're saying here is that our message app is going to be a container for our stateful app. Let's just see what that looks like. So we're not going to remove our greeting component. We're going to still use that, but we're going to use it in our stateful component. So let's first define our stateful component. I'm going to remove basically everything besides these two things, which will eventually end up into our stateful component. So first, let's define mag message app, and then we say object like that. Okay. Now in the object, the most important method is our view method. And the view method has our state, our properties, and everything. Now, what we want to do first and foremost is make this render. So there's a few things to consider here. So unlike a stateful component where you just call greeting, a stateful component is a little bit different. And let's just see what that looks like by simply doing the thing that we would normally do. So let's call this message app, like that. So normally we would just go like this, message app, and maybe pass in some properties. Let's just test this out. Oops. Okay, so we created a component, we're calling it. Now, in our component, currently, we don't really have anything. So why don't we add a simple I tag, an italic, okay? And we're gonna give it maybe a class, say my message. So how do we affect that, right? So first we have to access our state, and there's two ways to access state here. So you can do state props like this, or you can say this dot state or this dot props, okay? And for this example, we're going to use this, okay? So state is your selector, this dot I tag, say hello, like that. Now notice nothing is happening, right? Nothing happened to the page. The reason why it's white right now is, by the way, CodePen seems to be running. So this is what I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you that nothing changes in a dynamic app the way you expect it to. And let me show you why. Now if I console output here, what do you expect to see here? Let's see. I don't know if that error is new or old. Let me just change that. It looks like CodePen is still loading. The main point to note is the difference between how it's being handled when you have a stateful component, which is this object definition, versus a function component. We're going to do everything exactly the same way, but we're going to just see the subtle differences in how to, creatively work around them. What are our options, basically? So let's see what our error was again. Okay. I think CodePen is having some difficulties this morning. Let's see if we can work around them. Okay. Okay. So it appears as if we're not affecting anything. It appears that nothing is happening. And the simplest way to deal with this is you can now create a container like we did in the other one. You can, for instance, say mag body, for instance. That's one way to work around it, is you're creating a component and then you have to put it into container. So that creating a component is one thing. Running a component is another thing. Actually putting it somewhere is a third thing. So those are like kind of three stages. And that's what we're dealing with. So this is just defining it. This is simply calling it. And this is placing it somewhere else. Okay. What about our prop? Right? We said this dot props dot, what was it, test? Let's see what happens here. Let's see if are we accessing the prop as well. Is that happening here in a stateful component? Is it the same way? And as you can see, it is. It is the same way. It's being appended right there. So it is very similar. Okay. So far, everything seems exactly the same as the previous example, right? We define it, we call it, and we put it somewhere. Now, we don't want to put it to the body. We probably want to put it in our greeting, don't we? Why don't we do that? Okay, so now we're back to kind of where we were before, where we're defining it and we're putting it somewhere. But what we really want isn't just to do that here. We want to really put our greeting div in there, right? So why don't we try that? What happens if I call greeting like this? Simply. See, it's HTML. Well, let me get rid of this because that was turning it into a string. So see, nothing happened, right? You're like, well, wait a second. Why doesn't my italic, have the greeting message? What is going on here? So let's back up one more second. And instead of putting the I anyways, let's just say div container for now. Very simple, right? We have a generic div container that we want to put our component in. So I'll just say like this state.div, put my greeting in. And the question again remains, why isn't it happening? Why isn't it running? Well, when we talked about before cloning the div and having references to components, we needed a key. So if I add a key now, is it going to be remembered? See, now it can remember it. Now it knows, hey, you want a unique instance, and this is the instance. And the reason for that is because the view is being run multiple times. Okay, so now we have what we want. Let's now call our greeting the way it expects to be called. It expects a message. And also that click handler as well. Remember, click handler. It expects some sort of function here. So it sounds like we're ready to do some setup too. So we really want are these messages, right? So why don't we pass the messages in? I guess we don't need to do that. Just say messages like this. And now we want to randomize it too. We might even want to have a default message. So for instance, we might say state dot, or this dot state dot message. So what's our default message? So how do we get defaults? So now we're going into something more about stateful components. In stateful components, you have a controller method, which is basically your initializer. And in your initializer, you can set some initial state. So in here, you could say, for instance, this message equals my initial message, for instance. Oh, looks like I'm getting an error here. Messages. Doesn't like that. Maybe nope. Messages like that. No, it's a different error. Let me just check it out and see where it's coming from. Unexpected token. Ah, because I never defined my click handler. For now, I'll just put a arrow function, just a no op. So okay, so now we have everything going on. We have our message app being put into another component. So whenever you create a component, you're putting one component to another component basically, right? So that's what we're doing here. And we're creating an initial message. And what we really want is a click handler. So why don't we create a new method in here? We'll call it, let's say randomizer, let's say. Okay. So randomizer is going to have our randomizer message, and it's just going to return that. So this is a method, internal method, and it's going to get some messages. It's kind of an API. It doesn't know state at all. All it knows is that you have some messages, you want to do something to it, and you want to return something with it. Okay, that sounds good enough. Now, what about doing that for our initial message? We could do that, but instead, why don't we access our props here? So we can say props.messages. Let's just do the first one for now. Okay, so hello world shows up first. And on our on click, we want to do the randomizer. This dot randomizer. Well, I don't know if we want to call randomizer or we want to call, let's call a click handler first. Okay, so we're creating a layer of abstraction here. Say click handler equals a function. Now he is attached to the state, and he will call the randomizer who's not attached to the state. So what he's going to do is set the state message to the randomizer based on the props message. So this is an intermediary. Okay, so on click handler, the dummy component is going to call our click handler, which is attached to state and has access to our props and our state and our object itself. Our object is, think of this message more like an API call, while our click handler is kind of in between the API call and the state. And that's what it's going to do. It's going to pass in all of our messages from our props to the randomizer. Oh, I spelled randomizer wrong. Let me fix that. And he's going to, whatever he returns is going to be attached to the state as the message. And now whenever there's a change to the state, our view gets rerun. So unlike the controller initializer, which is only run that first time, the view is run on every change to the state. So why don't we see what happens when we click that? Now you can see the message is being updated each time. Okay. Now this ends this part 3 of the tutorial, but why don't we do a quick review? Let's look at our templates again. We have 3 different placeholders in our HTML. First, we started with our dummy component, and this is our core template. This is our stateless component, and it has a class so it can be easily cloned and used elsewhere because it's stateless. It has a place to put the message. You can call it a B tag, or you can have a class in here, say class equals message. It also has an ability and a button to have a callback to possibly change the message. But it doesn't do that. It doesn't understand. It just gets data and it outputs it. Now we have 2 other placeholders here. This specific placeholder is another component. It just happens to be a stateful component. And stateful components always have to have an ID. They have to be unique. So that's something to keep in mind too. Now in this particular case, the stateful component isn't really doing much except calling the dummy component and putting him right into its own div. But it is maintaining state. Now, in this particular case, we're then taking the output of our message app, our stateful component, and putting it into a placeholder. Okay, and that's usually what you would do is you have one component generate something and put it into another place. And that's what we're doing here. We have one component here being put into another component here, which is then being put into a placeholder. Now, we don't technically have to do that. It's just probably best practices to mentally do things like that is basically create components as we're doing here with our selector. And here's our stateless, which has a function. And here we're creating our message app component. And we're doing basically the same thing. We have our selector, except that instead of a function definition, we have an object definition. And then we're calling it here and putting it into something. Now, if you didn't want to, for whatever reason, put it somewhere else, and you wanted to just kind of affect the change of it by calling it like this, you wouldn't necessarily call it like this, in this way. You see what happens? Nothing really happened. See, it became blank. But if you wanted to affect it directly, there's another mag method that you can use. Instead of creating a component, which when you create a component, you usually call it with those arguments, the props, and then put it somewhere, you could simply go like this. Say mag.module. And that's basically telling it that you're in line, that you're happening in line. You're not happening somewhere else. Now, when that happens, you can see it's not outputting anything. You don't see anything, nothing changed, right? So the question is, what's going on here? What's the difference? Why this time is it not doing it? And the main reason is, as you can see here, our props are not being passed in. So unlike mag, let me just go back for a second. Unlike mag, where you pass in props this way, with mag module, you can pass in default props, right? In other words, if I did mag module like this, what do you think is going to happen? It doesn't understand because mag module is running right away. So you want to pass in your default props as a third argument. It's very similar to a mag constructor. Remember the mag constructor had default properties here, the third one. So it's the same thing. It's very similar to mag, except you do it over there. Now, let me see what happens when I click the button. See, it works perfectly. But let's look at the generate HTML and you see the difference. The generate HTML is not being put into the greeting anymore. We're actually affecting our message app itself. Instead of it seeing it as a reusable component, we're just saying, hey, we just want it to work right here. And that's just, again, it depends on your application and how you want to do it. But generally speaking, um, the first way to do it is probably the best way. So this first way of having each component render separately and then be called separately and then put somewhere else is usually the way to componentize and keep things tidy. And that's what I would suggest doing in this particular case is separate them, reuse them, and call them separately, just like this, okay? You can, of course, call the defaults over here as well, okay? The third property, and it would work just as well, okay? So you don't need to pass it. This is more for overriding, and this is more for default. So it doesn't matter where you put it, but the defaults exist over here. Oops. And the runtime is over here. That's just something to keep in mind. And with that being said, we're going to end this part 3 of getting started with MagJS in my first MagJS example. In this one, we talked about a couple things. Most importantly, we talked about state, and we also talked about reusing components. So I hope this was useful. Until next time, see you then. Bye-bye.